Over 12%. 12% of people who work within the tech industry believe from the bottom of their hearts that macOS is based on Linux. Over 1 in 10 people you meet in the tech industry believe that, oh, macOS is basically just a distribution of Linux. That's crazy to me. Even nuttier. Over 70% of people surveyed believe in at least one commonly debunked myth of computer history. This all comes from the 2025 Tech Industry Demographic Survey. We surveyed over 12,000 people. The spreadsheets we're getting from this are huge, and across the whole tech industry, a huge number of different companies, foundations, organizations, projects, podcast and YouTube fan bases all over the map, various political orientations, various technological orientations. It's really, really widespread. And the results are absolutely fascinating. Over the coming days and weeks, we're going to be going into a lot of different pieces of this survey, and some of them are going to be fun and goofy. Some of them are going to be very, very political. Today, we're going to start out with just some of these computer myths because I found the results to be a bit fascinating. So how this worked was I presented inside the survey a list of 6 commonly debunked myths within computer history, right? Things that people have said over the years that many people believe to be true, but are not actually true. For example, Bill Gates once said 640K ought to be enough for anybody, right? That's a commonly repeated myth in computer history. He never actually said that, right? It's not something that actually happened, but it's been repeated so many times that people feel like it happened. Another common one is that the first computer bug was a real bug. It was a moth that flew into a big computer, right? This is a commonly repeated myth. It's not at all true. It was just based on a joke. However, people believe it to be true. So we presented 6 different myths to people, and we had them check which ones they thought were factual, were real. Which ones did they believe were actual things and not myths at all? Well, here's what we found out. 12% of people believe that macOS is based on Linux. That one was surprising to me because I didn't realize that many people believed that, right? I kind of thought when I added that particular myth to the list, I thought the number would be far smaller than that. I thought it was more of a joke than anything else. It turns out 1 in 10 people really do genuinely believe that. Over 70% of people believed in at least one of the myths presented, right? They said, yeah, this is not a myth. This is a real thing to at least one of the 6 myths presented. The most commonly believed myth at 52%, so over half of everyone who responded said, yes, this is a fact, is the myth that the first computer bug was a real moth. That one, almost half of everyone said, yeah, that's a real, actual thing. And I've broken it down percentage-wise to show everyone kind of the rough breakout of which myths were the most widely believed. A lot of people also believe that the first programmable computer was the ENIAC in 1945. It's not. 29% believe that the first computer programmer was Lady Ava Lovelace. She was not. Another 29% believed in the Bill Gates 640K quote, which obviously he did not say. A little over 10% of people believed that the term open source was coined by Christine Peterson in 1998. That one was interesting to me because I expected that one to be a little bit more widespread, but it may just very well be that is a myth that has been pushed by people, but really hasn't gained widespread traction. Anyway, so that's the breakdown per myth. Now, here's what really is strange to me. Let's dive into the 12% of people believe macOS is based on Linux myth. that 12% stayed roughly the same no matter what subgroup or demographic we looked at. For example, if we looked at just people who said, hey, I prefer using Windows as my operating system, roughly 12% of those people thought macOS was based on Linux. The same was true for people who said, I prefer using macOS. Roughly 12% of them, give or take, within like about half a percentage point, thought it was based on Linux. Linux users, roughly 12% of them thought, give or take, thought that macOS was based on Linux. Whether you used Firefox, whatever programming languages you were proficient in, no matter which way we looked at it, it stayed between 11% and 12.5+% of that any given subgroup believed that macOS was based on Linux. This particular myth is consistent across almost every demographic we can figure out how to measure using this survey. And again, over 12,000 respondents. So we've got a really, really wide mix and a deep, deep sample set to work from. It's absolutely fascinating to me. Now, the one outlier to all of this was when we looked at how many myths a person says that they believed in, right? So whether they checked one checkbox for one myth or two myths or three myths, right? When we looked at how many myths a person says that they thought were true, and we grouped those people by their political leanings, we saw one thing stick out. And here's a chart for that. This is the only outlier we could find. You'll notice on the left, it has people that believe in at least one myth, meaning they checked the checkbox once. They said, yes, this one myth, or maybe more, but at least one checkbox was checked. If you went with that, it was between 72.5% and 75.5%, no matter what their political leanings were, whether they were left-leaning, centrist, or right-leaning politically. It was real close, right? I mean, we're talking with just a couple percentage points. You start working in like a margin of error, and they're statistically almost identical, right? The same was true for people who believed in lots of myths, right? So someone who said, I believe in 4 or more of these 6 myths. Yeah, these are all true, right? Those numbers were very, very small, no matter what your political leanings were. Left-leaning people was 3.18%, centrist 3.7%, right-leaning 2.6%, right? Very, very, very similar. I mean, all within like a 1 percentage point margin there for all of them. The right-leaning folks seem to be less likely to believe in a huge number of myths than the centrist or left-leaning folks, but the difference was so minuscule that if you ran this survey again, you might get slight changes to those numbers. So it was pretty close. But if you look in the middle, people who believe 3 or more myths, right? So half of the available myth options. People who were left-leaning were likely to believe 3 or more myths 34% of the time, whereas centrists and right-leaning people were only 26% of the time. So meaning there was an 8% jump, an 8% spike in believing 3 or more myths if you were left-leaning politically. Now, that's not a huge off-the-charts spike here we're talking about. I mean, but it is the most statistically noticeable spike of any subgroup that I could find to measure, whether you're a Rust programmer or a Python programmer, or what other operating system you use, or what your feelings are on open source. It almost didn't seem to matter for a lot of things. But when we really drilled into it, this was the one spike. People who identified as left-leaning politically were about 8%, or about 8% increase in the likelihood that they believed a number of myths, right? Now, once you got to a huge number of myths, like most of the myths you believed in, well, then it dropped right back down, and everyone was equal again. Now, just in case anyone is curious, I put up an article with all of these myths in it and links to where I've debunked these particular myths in the past, some many years in the past. The 640K ought to be enough for anybody. The bug is a moth thing, all those sorts of things. I put them up so you can follow those links and check out the real data for yourself. This is a little bit fascinating to me and a little bit disappointing. I was surprised at how prevalent the myths were, regardless of the demographics, how widely accepted they were. Because some of these myths are so easily debunked, right? Like the first computer bug being a moth. Like it really, really was not. The macOS is based on Linux. Well, that's a real easy one to debunk. That really was not. But to be fair, all 6 of the myths presented have been repeated so often that a huge number of people believe in them. The least believed in ones still were believed by 1 in 10 people within the IT industry, almost regardless of their demographic. And the fact that some of them, at least one of them, was believed by over half of everybody. That's intense. That really goes to show you how easy it is and how prevalent easy it is for these myths of history to take hold and to become really, really prevalent throughout modern society. When you have tech journalists and people on social media and bloggers and YouTubers and podcasters and everyone's repeating these myths over and over and over again, it becomes cemented. People believe that those things are true, and they just can't be forced to not believe them anymore. They can't be convinced otherwise. The bug being a moth, that particular one, I've done shows about that. I've posted articles about that, and even among people who seem to really like the Lunduke Journal, a significant percentage of them do still believe in that particular myth. I'm not harping on anybody here. I'm not dogging on any of all y'alls. I'm just saying these myths are really common and they're really deeply entrenched. It's fascinating that there really isn't a difference based on what your demographic is for whether or not you are likely to believe in these myths. That is amazing to me. Such a slight spike for left-leaning people, politically left-leaning people, believing in some extra myths, but that's about it. And it's a very small one. Very, very small one. Thank you to the Lunduke Journal subscribers for allowing me to do all of this crazy work. I could not do this without you. Go to lunduke.com and click on all the links so where you can read all the articles, watch all the shows, listen to the podcast, support the work that I do, which has absolutely no advertisements in it. That's pretty sweet. No big tech influence. Love that very much. And you can go to lunduke.com and click on all the things. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare, end broadcast.